Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Leah McGrath, the Executive Director of StateRAMP. Hi, Leah. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great to get a perspective on StateRAMP. We primarily have an audience who, of course, is familiar with the FedRAMP program and how that works. Can you just give us an overview of the StateRAMP mission and organization and how it all works?
Definitely. So StateRAMP, we are a nonprofit organization. We have members in both the public sector and private sector, and we were founded actually in 2020 by a group of former and current state CIOs, CISOs, privacy officers, procurement officers who joined together with private sector leaders to kind of say, how could we do this together? Right? They're all facing this challenge of how to verify and validate that the technologies they're utilizing meet minimum cybersecurity standards. And because every government entity from state to local to K-12 and higher ed are all facing that same challenge, they came together to say, what if we did this as a group? What would that look like? How would it work? And StateRAMP was born out of those discussions. And so our mission is really to bring all the levels of government together with the private sector to really educate on best practices for cybersecurity, for cloud security, to drive toward that common standard, that uniform, kind of standard that we can point to. And then by having that, independently validate and verify that the technologies meet those security standards, not just once, but in an ongoing fashion. So that is our mission. That's what, we're about. And it's been a true pleasure to be a part of this.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of cool, I imagine, to see something grow organically like that. How has StateRAMP grown and evolved since it was established just a few years ago? And roughly how many states are using the standards today?
Sure. Well, we were founded, our founders, if you will, are Joe Belaski, the president of Knowledge Services, and J.R. Sloan, who is the chief information officer from the state of Arizona. And it was really those two who had that discussion in early 2020 that led to a steering committee and ultimately StateRAMP. And so we launched in January of 2021 with this, idea of, hey, let's come together to do this. And, initially it was a little bit of a chicken and egg, right? The governments, the states, the locals were all looking to say, we want to do this, but will the private sector be a part of it? And the private sector was kind of saying the same thing. We'd like to come on board, but is this something that government will participate in? And, over the years, I guess it's been a little more than 3 years now, we've just seen rapid growth and adoption and interest. And we've iterated the program as well because of the member involvement and engagement. Right now, you ask the question, who's participating or how many? We've got 25 states who've announced they're participating with StateRAMP and working with StateRAMP to help validate, their supplier security. And then we have almost 400 provider members. So we have just seen, like I said, rapid growth and interest in the program. And J.R. Sloan, who is the CIO from Arizona I mentioned, who's also president of our board, has said, I think it's the right solution for the right time. In 2020 and in 2021, we all knew the challenges that government was facing, that the public sector was facing. I don't think any of us, though, anticipated fast forward a few years, well, we didn't see COVID coming initially, right? But then just the level of threat that we're seeing, whether it's malware, ransomware, or, just good old fashioned cybersecurity breaches that are coming through, and public sectors really being affected by that. And we're seeing it, often coming through those third-party suppliers. So we've got to work together to solve that challenge and to have that stronger cyber defense. And so I think StateRAMP's given an entry point for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure as in the federal government at the state level, the pandemic really drove a lot of digital
It
service
did.
adoption.
It
Yeah.
did.
And I noticed on the website that, in some cases you have whole states who have adopted the program, and then in other cases you have maybe, a court system
Sure.
or something like that. So it's kind of different across the states in terms of how wide scale they're adopting it.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a great point to make. StateRAMP is our security program is modeled in part after the federal program FedRAMP, in that we both rely on those NIST 853 controls as our baseline for the requirements. We've got, we require an independent audit by a third-party assessing organization for our state ramp authorization or ready statuses, really similar to the federal program. But what we found as we got into this is a couple of things. One, we have a centralized program management office model, meaning, there's no such thing as an agency sponsor in StateRAMP in our program. So it was really important that we find a way to bring innovation faster to governments in a more secure fashion. We wanted to kind of reduce any barriers to participation for the provider community to say, if you'd like to come through, you can come through. So we have an approvals committee that is made up of our 5 government members who every month are reviewing those, kind of the work of the PMO to make sure we've got those checks in place. So those are some of the things that are different, but really what we found as we got into this were 2 key differences from the federal space. And one is in state and local government. There's no mandate that covers all of state and local government, and every state is unique. Every local government is unique. But we share really common challenges. And where there's commonality is where we have the opportunity to come together and have a shared service like StateRAMP. And so we really drive toward where are those commonalities. So what you see from states or local governments participating is exactly what you caught on to when you were looking at our participating governments on our website. Every state's going to do it a little bit differently. So we definitely have some that are kind of statewide, some that are really driving toward more of a whole of state, bringing local governments along as well. And then we have some that are maybe starting with the court system, right? That agency who's, looking at how do we leverage StateRAMP to validate our suppliers. And so there's a range of government participation. That's something that has really been iterated, and we're continuing to kind of work to help support those governments who want to participate with StateRAMP, because, on one end, kind of that first entry point for a government might be to say, I accept StateRAMP meets my requirements. So if you come in with a StateRAMP authorization or you're part of our Progressing Snapshot program, then that's the easy button into this state, right? Perhaps because you've shown that you've satisfied those requirements. To the other end of the spectrum, where we're starting to see some of the states or local governments require StateRAMP or make that a preference in their, kind of contracting process, because they want that level of assurity, but also that transparency and visibility into the continuous monitoring and reporting. So we see a range of ways that government, states, locals, education are adopting StateRAMP, and that's something we encourage. Because we want to encourage every state, and local, wherever they are in their own maturity cycle, because it's a spectrum, right? Cybersecurity never ends. You got to really love this race if you're getting into it, because it doesn't have an end point. And so we really encourage any state or local government, wherever they are in their maturity around third-party risk management or cybersecurity, to just start where they're ready to start. And then we've got some different services and support teams who can help them continue to grow.
It's a great point. There's no mandate that covers the 50 states, quite like there is, the mandate for federal agencies to use FedRAMP. Are you, is your job, is the program office's job really just getting out there and hustling and getting the word out? Are you getting a lot of more demand maybe these days,
Oh,
just
definitely.
with the rise in cyber attacks? I got to imagine folks are wondering how they can secure themselves given just the scourge of ransomware and other cyber attacks.
Yeah, we definitely see when there's a cyber attack, particularly when there's a breach that affects multiple entities, we certainly see an uptick there. Where we're seeing a lot of organic outreach coming right now is from local government and K-12 schools, where they are looking for how do we, they're commonly the most at risk and the least resourced. So they really need that shared services model to be able to do the very best job they can in vetting the suppliers that they are working with, but also in making sure that, like I said, on an ongoing basis, those providers are meeting those requirements for them. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of organic outreach and growth coming from. With the states. You asked, are we out there hustling? I just have to say we have incredible strategic partners, and that really, our steering committee, our strategic partners include organizations like the National Association of State Chief Information Officers, NASCIO, or NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officers. We work with the MSISAC is a strategic partner, and CIS, as well as the Center for Digital Government, Public Technology Institute. And now I have to stop naming things, Justin, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget someone, but those are some of our just incredible partners. And so in terms of how we are helping spread the word about the opportunities and the resources, it's really partnering with those organizations and National Association of State Technology Directors to get in front of those team members, but also to understand what are the challenges they are facing? How do we continue to iterate to meet the needs? One of the things that we're working, we've got 2 initiatives that are probably worth mentioning here that are ongoing. And one is we've got a CJIS-focused task force. So one of the things that we talk quite often about is framework harmonization. And I'll say StateRAMP is the starting point for framework harmonization. It is something that our standards and technical committee, our leadership is really passionate about. And I have a passion for this too, because we often hear about the challenges from framework harmonization perspective. If you're talking to states and local government leaders, they're going to point to the federal government, right? The federal government has all of these requirements that flow down to states and locals that impact them. And it's the acronym alphabet. It's CJIS, it's IRS, it's HIPAA, it's MARSI, it's MMIS, it's FERPA, it's all the different requirements out there that flow down to states and locals that they're trying to make sense of, that they have to comply with. And they have to make sure some of their providers comply with. And that's really hard because sometimes there's disharmony between the networks and they all are based on different things, right? And so it becomes a challenge. What we are really trying to do is help sort that out for states and local governments through our committees and our governance structure to say, let's take them on one at a time and understand how do they map to NIST 853 Rev 5? How can they map to our controls so that we can and go really specific into the weeds to say, at that even parameter control standpoint, how do we make sure that we're covering the requirements that states are having to meet or that locals are having to meet? And so we have a CJIS-focused task force. Just really appreciate the leadership that comes out of the CJIS office with Chris Weatherly and team. They're phenomenal. They're already working on that mapping to NIST 853 Rev 5, which helps us. But at the end of the year, what we're working toward, we've got about 50 committee members from the public sector and private sector who are working on this. At the end of the year, what we're hoping to be able to roll out is an overlay to our moderate impact level. And that overlay would essentially map to then what are the CJIS requirements. And our goal with that, every state may have nuances because they do. Some states have adopted above and beyond requirements, right, to privacy or whatever. That's fine. What we can do is look at what is that baseline? What is the CJIS requirement that's flowing down? And with that overlay, be able to say, hey, provider, you want to be CJIS compliant, or hey, state or local, you're looking for CJIS compliance. This is a tool that you can use to be able to measure that. So that's a really important initiative. And our goal is to really take them kind of one by one and help break that down. But the other way that framework harmonization really impacts the private sector, the provider community, is in that every state or local may interpret some of these requirements differently. So you hear that all the time, right? So if we can help bring everybody together to drive toward that common understanding and acceptance of a baseline standard, we are making it far easier, I hope, for the provider community to be able to demonstrate that compliance once in order to serve their many government customers. And so framework harmonization is a huge initiative. And then just really quickly, the second initiative would be around our, we have a procurement task force. And that is a joint task force with the National Association of State Procurement Officers. And then we've got some folks from NASIO involved in that as well. And then it's really bringing procurement officials and experts together from the public sector with those IT folks and coming out of it with some great tools, very practical, right, tools for procurement officials across the country to be able to leverage when they're looking at what are those terms and conditions and when should StateRAMP apply or how should it apply and how do I do this in a more consistent and standard manner. And so that's another effort that we've heard, when you think about governments, change is hard in any organization, change management, right? When you're trying to do it in the public sector, it's really hard because you're constantly hit with a new fire every day you've got to put out. And so what we're trying to do is provide easier to use resources to be able to make that change and adopt StateRAMP more confidently and consistently.
Interesting. Yeah, I think bringing together the procurement and IT folks is always such a critical thing, especially with security. You mentioned a term earlier, CJIS. What
Yes.
is that
Oh, I
mean?
apologize. I mentioned
That's okay.
all of the acronyms.
Yeah.
CJIS is the Criminal Justice Information Systems requirements. And so when I was referring to CJIS, so what that is, those are requirements that are established at the FBI level that any of the data that might be stored or processed or transmitted within that criminal justice information system. So think courts, think police departments, state police, local, right? Anytime that data is being accessed or transmitted or stored, it needs to meet a higher level of standards to ensure that privacy and data protection.
Very critical requirement. Okay, good. Thank you for explaining that. That's
Of
great.
course.
No,
I apologize.
so
I didn't start there.
oh no, it's okay. No, we're used to acronyms here at Federal News Network. It's totally
Right,
fine, but I
right.
just want to make sure our audience understands, maybe a new one for them,
There you
for
go.
me at least. Yeah. And then in terms of, I know we've talked about the different aspects, the different components of the states that are adopting StateRAMP, but in terms of the technology services, the specific digital services that states are adopting, are there any trends? Are there any ways that states are adopting cloud services that are worth highlighting here?
The thing that comes to mind immediately is, I don't know if it's a trend or if it's just the topic of the day, right, is certainly AI. So there's a lot of focus on understanding when a technology is leveraging generative AI, understanding how that, what's the formula behind it, right? How is it coming up with that data? And is there any potential bias or privacy consideration that we need to be aware of? And so I don't know if I think that's a question that you'll start seeing more often with technologies that are being procured or utilized. I think there are many AIs built into a lot of technology we're already using, but now that there's such a focus, I think that you'll see more questions around that and how it's being used and how it's being generated. So that's definitely something that we hear a lot of questions around. From our perspective, we are participating on the AI Safety Consortium with NIST. And so with that AI Safety Consortium, from our perspective, we're looking at two things that we think are really important there. One is to make sure we don't create more disharmony. I mentioned that the challenge of all the different frameworks, whether it's criminal justice or IRS or, CMS healthcare things or education related, I want to, we're really trying to make sure we don't make it harder by creating another unique framework that, potentially conflicts with other requirements or creates more work, but rather could it be adjunctive to or an additional, subset of controls that we add in when there's an AI component, because really a lot of that comes down to your foundational cybersecurity best practices. So how do we make sure that we're not creating a new thing, but just kind of adding on to what we've already got where applicable? So that's something that we talk quite a bit about is, let's be smart in how we go about adopting it, utilizing it, but also how we go about creating what these new standards look like.
Absolutely. I think that's a conversation that's happening at every level of government today,
Definitely.
within the technologist community, certainly. And, obviously, we should touch on the overlap between FedRAMP and StateRAMP and all these other kind of authorization programs. How does that work? I know FedRAMP is kind of intertwined with StateRAMP a little bit. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So our standards and technical committee every year has affirmed that our baseline requirements are built off of NIST 853. And we just recently last year updated those requirements to NIST 853 Rev 5, the newest version of that National Institute of Standards and Technology publication. In part because we really wanted to create alignment between StateRAMP and FedRAMP. So as we were working through what do those impact levels look like, low and moderate and high, spent some time with the FedRAMP office throughout to make sure that we were in sync, that we weren't creating disharmony, right? But that we were making sure, for the provider community, we're all part of the same ecosystem. So how do we make sure that the providers who are working toward FedRAMP, how do we make that simple for them to then leverage StateRAMP if they'd like to do that as well? So our baseline requirements by impact level align very well between StateRAMP and FedRAMP. We also have a fast track program. So for providers who are completing a security package or an audit to go for FedRAMP, they can actually submit that same security package and audit to StateRAMP. They don't have to use StateRAMP templates. We try to be really flexible there to say, you can bring that on through to the StateRAMP process to become StateRAMP ready or authorized, depending on what they're going for, even before they become FedRAMP ready or authorized. So we really try to make that open. Some of the differences between our programs, I kind of alluded to this before, but it was really important to our steering committee in those early days that any provider who wants to become StateRAMP authorized could become StateRAMP authorized, regardless of contract status, regardless of a relationship that they may or may not have, right, with a government. And so there is no requirement to have an agency sponsor like what you have in the FedRAMP space or, kind of JAB authorization. So with StateRAMP, any provider who wants to come through and bring their product through our process can. And we do that by having, we have an approvals committee, as I mentioned, who kind of serves as that government sponsor, if you will, on the back end, who says, hey, we're going to provide that secondary check. So you have a few things that happen, right? The provider has that independent audit by a third-party assessing organization. They're submitting it to our program management office, and we have that centralized PMO function to ensure that it's just consistent application of standards. It's probably more akin in the FedRAMP space to a JAB authorization because we're not making exceptions or acceptance of risk. It is, it's a consistent application of what those requirements are. And so the PMO is looking at that audit by the 3PAO and the security package to validate and verify, yep, they meet the requirements established by the StateRAMP governance committees. Then it goes to, if they're going for authorized, it goes to the approvals committee for that final check. So that is a difference. And, we also have one of the things that is different between StateRAMP and FedRAMP is our progressing product list. So we call our authorized product list. That's for our statuses that go through that full authorization process for StateRAMP ready, authorized, or provisional, similar to FedRAMP. But we also have a progressing product list. And that was important because we wanted to be able to show all of the products that are working toward StateRAMP ready or authorized. So that includes those products that have either engaged a 3PAO for an audit, or maybe they've submitted their package and it's pending review by the PMO and approvals committee. So that's the progressing product list. But the other thing that is unique to StateRAMP is that we found early on that many of the providers who serve state and local government, right, they're never going to be applicable in the FedRAMP space because they don't serve the federal government, right? So many of those providers who are working in state and local government just weren't quite ready for an audit by a 3PAO. So we found ourselves in 2021 having a lot of conversations, trying to create education, trying to create, ways to help support. So by 2022, we realized we need something that comes before that StateRAMP ready or authorized status. Before they're ready for that, how do we meet the needs of the providers to understand, what do I not know, right? What's my gap? And for our public sector members to be able to have visibility into where are the strengths and the risks. So our committee members and our board created, and with a lot of help from our PMO, created what we call our StateRAMP Security Snapshot. And we updated this last year. And this, I have to take a minute because I love this program. It is our fastest growing program by far, because I think it just met that need right where people are. And it's, how do I get started? You start with Snapshot. So what our Snapshot does is, think of it like a mini audit. There's a virtual audit with our program management office. We have 41 items of criteria that map to NIST 853. And what the committees and PMO did was select the 41 highest scoring controls based on that MITRE attack framework. So what are, wherever those 41 controls out of that StateRAMP ready or FedRAMP ready baseline, right? We took those 41 highest scoring threat controls, and we said, this is our snapshot, because we wanted to really drive toward not just compliance, but good, positive outcomes. And so if this is where the threat's the greatest, let's start there. So we start with those 41 controls, and then they are weighted. They're scoring, but it's weighted based on that risk score that it was given. And so it really incentivizes providers to work on what matters most first to be able to increase their score. So they have a snapshot completed with our PMO. It's a mini audit. It's a virtual audit. In order to score points in each line item of criteria, they have to provide evidence that that is being completed. And so at the end, they get a score, but they, more importantly, are able to see, what's my risk? Where do I need to work on, right? What are the gaps? And the goal is to be able to work with these providers so that at some point they're ready for that StateRAMP ready audit or that StateRAMP authorized audit that is going to show more complete compliance with those NIST 853 best practices. So that program is our fastest growing by far. It has been just really exciting to see the adoption of it by both government as well as our provider community, and in the value that it's bringing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think in a lot of conversations around federal security compliance programs, you always hear about the push and pull between allowing, POAMs, plans of actions and milestones, or some sort of midway point. It sounds as if this security snapshot really offers providers that option if they're not ready to go full bore.
It helps get them started, but the reality is most of these providers are already working with states and local governments, and you can't just, we'd love to, right? But we cannot freeze time and stop doing business, because we're reliant on these technologies to deliver government services. So what we can do, though, is work with these providers to say, okay, tell me what's your risk now. It's a risk assessment. Tell me where you are, so that at least I have, as a government, visibility into where my potential threats may be, right? And I can mitigate that if I know it's there. I can't mitigate it if I don't know it's there. So it just gives wide open visibility into where are the strengths, where are the risks, and then helps us progress. That's why we call it our progressing. The idea is not to stand still, but we actually have a progressing snapshot program that our PMO helped develop that says, okay, every quarter you get to update your snapshot score with that audit, so it can be updated and show progress. And then every month they meet for an hour with our advisory team to help them identify, how do I need to go forward? What are those kind of cost efficient, simple things I can do, or maybe they're complex things that I can do to help mature my score, to help mature my security program. Texas is a state that we work very closely with. And so if you're a part of our Progressing Snapshot program, you're automatically given, and you've had your snapshot and you're staying up on your snapshot, I should say that, as long as you're participating in the Progressing Snapshot program, you are able to achieve and receive automatic provisional status for Texas to be able to do work in Texas. And so it's recognizing, right, that the providers who are part of the Progressing Snapshot program those are products that they're really committed to growing the security posture and progressing in that way. And so it demonstrates certainly for their government customers that commitment to security and transparency, which ultimately is how we get stronger together.
All right, well, you've laid out a lot for us. You've laid out two big initiatives for
Yeah.
StateRAMP this year, but 23 states, more than 400 providers. Are there any big goals on the horizons for further growing the program that you can share with
Absolutely.
us? Any big plans this year otherwise?
Yes, thank you for asking. We are holding our first in-person event, well, conference. We've had some last year, but our first conference this year, September 12th, is our StateRAMP Cyber Summit with presenting sponsor Carasoft. That is in Indianapolis, Indiana. You can find more about it on our website at stateramp.org. And really excited about the agenda we'll be releasing here in the next few weeks. But we've got a great lineup of speakers and the opportunity to bring these different stakeholders together who are so important to cybersecurity, whether it's from the public sector side, the procurement folks, with the IT folks, as you mentioned, sometimes we call ourselves the bridge between. So being able to bring them to the table with our private sector partners and the consulting and advisory groups as well who are part of StateRAMP, we're just so thrilled to have that opportunity. We have a few events kind of surrounding the summit. On Wednesday, we are working with the Center for Digital Government in collaboration with NASCIO, the Public Technology Institute and MSISAC are collaborators as well, where we are all kind of hosting a state and local CISO symposium. So that's Wednesday, September 11th, just for that public sector for state and local CISOs. We're going to talk about framework harmonization and really just have some great discussion for the chief information security officers at different levels to talk about what are the challenges they're facing and how could we work together to solve those challenges. And then that Friday, the 13th, very ominous day, I know, but Friday, September 13th, we will be meeting in person with our provider community. So September in Indianapolis, invite anyone who would be interested in coming to join us. I think it's going to be a great day of discussion. So that is a big goal in terms of growing our membership. I feel really optimistic about that. So I think you're going to see increased participation throughout the year. We've got a number of states who are working on announcements. So you can follow that along at our website. We do list out our participating governments, and then we have an e-news we send every month. So anyone who wants to stay up to date, those are good ways to do so. And just appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing and to bring more people to the table.
All right, Leah McGrath is the Executive Director of StateRAMP. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm Justin Doubleday. You're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the StateRAMP Exchange.